Colossus. The Reavers had headquarters in the Australian outback, which the X-Men squatted in and claimed for their own for a while. This was after the X-Men ambushed the Reavers and sent many of them through the Siege Perilous in Uncanny X-Men number 229, the fates of whom we never really get the chance to find out. But not all the Reavers were sent through the portal, and a handful escaped via Gateway's portal, only to eventually come back and reclaim their outback base in a revenge raid against the X-Men. In Uncanny X-Men number 251, they crucified Wolverine and had hoped to do worse to the X-Men at large, but thanks to the Siege Perilous, they did not get the chance. Psylocke had a premonition about the X-Men's deaths and knew the only way to save everyone's life was to open the Siege Perilous and convince the team to step through it. Colossus was the first to step through, and it's hinted that Psylocke used a bit of psychic coercion to get him to do it, because he said nothing about his family or his sister as he was leaving, which is utterly unlike Petey, who is always a family man at heart, especially if he's risking never seeing them again. Piotr re-emerged from the Perilous 8 issues later in Uncanny X-Men number 259. He appeared naked and amnesiac, somehow inside a Soho apartment building, but it was definitely right place, right time, because he managed to help save Jenny Ransom and Philip Moreau from some Genosian magistrates that were after them. He couldn't remember anything about his past, including any of his time as an X-Man, or that he was even a mutant at all, so he lived a very regular human life for a while. He got a job as a caretaker at that same Soho apartment that he appeared in, and he found some success as an artist going by the name Peter Nicholas. His true nature was always boiling deep within him, though, because his art shows would feature twisted metallic sculptures, which I think were supposed to be like symbolic of his subconscious being aware of his ability to turn into Colossus, even if his conscious awakening still couldn't connect the dots. Peter became acquainted with the recently beautified Callisto, but she didn't recognize him because the Morlocks had only ever known him in his armored form, so it was kind of like two non-strangers meeting for the first time. She was now a successful model whose portrait was on billboards and stuff, and she kind of became his first muse for a bit, and they developed like a romantic relationship with each other. At one of his art shows, his old teammate The Beast recognized him and tried to talk to him, but Peter was still suffering from amnesia and had no clue who he was. Hank figured this might have been some sort of undercover operation, and he didn't want to blow Peter's cover by exposing him, even though it was very un-Peter-like to simply not acknowledge his old friend. Later that night, Peter was attacked by the psychic vampire Crimson, who fed off of his repressed emotions and memories of being a former X-Man. For a brief moment, he remembered his past, but the Beast jumped into action and saved him, and as Crimson escaped, Peter forgot everything again, and it was clear to Hank that he was suffering from an authentic amnesia. Peter's human life was never peaceful, though, because he got embroiled with even more superhuman drama after he and the beautiful Callisto were kidnapped by Mask and the Morlocks. It was Mask who had beautified Callisto in the first place in an effort to torture her, but seeing as how she was now happy, he decided to torture her love muffin, Peter Nicholas, instead. He clocked how similar Peter looked to Colossus and decided to make his skin look just like Colossus's armored form. Mask was still under the delusion that the X-Men were dead after their televised battle with the adversary during the Fall of the Mutant storyline, so even though he clocked how similar Peter looked to Colossus, he didn't actually think this was the real Colossus. But inspiration strikes where it strikes, and Mask morphed his skin to look like Colossus, even if it wasn't him, which it obviously was. I mean, who could forget that chiseled jawline? Mask's manipulation sort of helped to re-trigger Colossus's mutant power, though, because later, as he and Callisto were fighting off the Morlocks to escape, Mask tried to stab Peter, but the blade didn't pierce his skin because his actual armored form had kicked in and saved him from it. One would think that Peter would figure this out, but because Peter was already reshaped by Mask to look like he was wearing armor, no one was more the wiser that he had a mutant ability, including Peter himself, and he just chalked his survival up to adrenaline. Peter and Callisto were saved from the Morlocks by Jean and Forge, who of course recognized Colossus right away, but much like how the Beast didn't know what was up with his memory, they too didn't know how to address it, and they decided to just let him live his new life since he looked so happy. He had a budding romance with Callisto, had good friends in Jenny and Philip, so why ruin all that by dragging him back into the mutant melodrama of the X-Men? Peter and Callisto decided to try to live happily ever after with one another, and they did for a little while. His last appearance as a tortured artist, Peter Nicholas, was in Uncanny X-Men number 264, and he wouldn't show up again until Uncanny X-Men number 277 during the Muir Island saga. At some point between all those issues, he had fallen under the thrall of the Shadow King, who unlocked his mutant potential as Colossus and was using him to attack the New Mutants dance instructor Stevie Hunter, whom the Shadow King needed in order to safely make his way through the mansion security system so that he could kill Professor X. The Shadow King was possessing everyone around this time, and many of the X-Men had already fallen at the hands of Moira McTaggart's possessed Muir Island X-Men. I mean, bless Stevie's little heart for putting up a fight against Colossus, but she never really stood a chance here, and ultimately she indirectly led him directly to Xavier. Shadow King commanded Colossus to attack both Stevie and Charles, and I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been for these two rather frail individuals to see the behemoth of Colossus coming at them. They did manage to apprehend him with the mansion security system for a bit, but you can't keep a hunk like Peter down for long, and just as he was ready to strike a killing blow to Stevie Hunter, Professor X finally managed to hijack his mind and ward off the Shadow King's nasty influence. In order to do this, though, Charles had to undo the Siege Perilous's amnesia and unlock all of Colossus's memories, including those of being an X-Man. This restored Peter's sense of self, and combined with Professor X's strength of mind, together they purged his consciousness of the Shadow King's influence. Colossus then swiftly rejoined the X-Men as they split into their iconic 90s blue and gold teams, and the rest is history. Obviously, everything worked out well for Colossus, as he is still one of the most popular characters in the comic books today, but I'm torn in considering if the Siege Perilous was good or bad for him. It gave him the chance to live life as an artist, which is nice because we know how much he loves art, but being a famous art superstar was never really on his bucket list. Peter's heart is always back home, mowing the Russian countryside with his family, so even though the cosmic awareness within the Siege Perilous was kind enough to bestow him this glitzy fate, it was so asynchronous with the Peter who we knew that it made him feel a bit vacuous to me. It was clear through his twisted and tormented sculptures that he was never truly experiencing an inward sense of peace either. If anything, traveling through the siege benefited others more so than it did him. The lives of Jenny Ransom, Philip Moreau, and even Callisto were all enriched because of it, while Peter himself, though happy, always felt like something more was missing from his life. I guess in the end, it was a good thing for him to pass through the portal, as he got to experience a life he'd never otherwise have lived, full of glamour and prestige. But there's a tinge of sadness to how his story unfolded too, so it ain't a full gold star rating from me.